6 years and 1 day after Hitler invaded Poland, Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender. September 2nd, 1945. No one will ever know how many died. No one will ever know the name of the first or the last victim. But they are the story of the Second World War. Not the tanks that could not move, or the planes that could not fly, or the ships that could not sail without them. War is about people, in uniform or not. People in cities, villages, jungles. Strangers as allies. Neighbors as enemies. Hundreds of millions of people, for whom for 6 years and 1 day, there was hell on earth. Two great empires have been created in just months. The war enters its 3rd year. There are battlefields in Eastern Europe, in North Africa, and in the Asia-Pacific. Before the year is out, hammer blows will transform the complexion of the war in each of those theaters. Advance will become retreat, and the lives of scores of millions of people will be defined by violence. The Italian invasion of Egypt had started on the 13th of September 1940. The British countered, and by the 20th of that month, no Italian troops were left on Egyptian soil.
After less than 50 hours, advance elements of our mechanized forces ashore had pushed through the Italian positions and cut off the enemy divisions attempting to hold Sidi Barrani. In this preliminary advance on the Western Desert, our forces have been completely successful. The Duce's men, both native and Italian, are on the run.
At the beginning of January 1941, Hitler announced plans to support Italy, and on the 6th of February, he appointed General Erwin Rommel to command the German Libya contingent, which became the Deutsche Afrika Korps.
The leadership qualities of Rommel have always been a subject of great debate and also great myth.
On February 24th, British and German troops clashed in Libya for the first time. On June 15th, Wavell, in command, launched the operation that was hoped would sweep east to west across North Africa. It was called Battle Axe. After 3 days, Wavell cabled his government.
I regret to report the failure of Battle Axe.
Churchill said,
Rommel has torn the new won laurels from Wavell's brow and thrown them in the sand.
Defeat persuaded Churchill to send Wavell to India. Lieutenant Heinz Schmidt, Rommel's aide-de-camp, reported the opposite effect on the Axis.
Everywhere that Rommel went now, the troops beamed at him. He was in the process of becoming a hero.
And what a scoop he was for Dr. Goebbels, who, by lionizing the Marshal, used him to the utmost advantage as a heaven-sent piece of propaganda.
Then on the 21st of January 1942, Rommel attacked. He had 3 German and 7 Italian divisions. Mersa fell to the 21st Panzer Division, with the 15th Panzer on its right, sweeping the British out of Wadi Faraig. Place names often, as Cliff Everton recalled, without associated places.
When you hear the names, you can't visualize what it is. Sit here and say, what would you expect to find there? Nothing. It's just a name.
Rommel pushed northeast of the Gazala line, opening the Battle of the Cauldron at the end of the month. Brigadier Claude Valentin was an early casualty.
I spotted 2 tanks about 1,500 yards ahead. We pulled up and a quick look through glasses made me suspicious of their silhouette. More than ever, as 2 gun flashes from them were followed by a shell arriving about 20 yards away. I halted to collect my thoughts. While doing so, I got Cutler to lug out my bottle of whiskey and we all had a small tot.
Valentin was taken prisoner on June 10th. By the 18th, Rommel had isolated Tobruk.
Rommel wants Tobruk because he wants to be able to bring up his supplies by sea, and it will make his push towards the Egyptian border much easier.
The fall of Tobruk triggered a no-confidence motion against the government in the House of Commons. The member for Kidderminster moved
That this House, while paying tribute to the heroism and endurance of the armed forces of the Crown, has no confidence in the central direction of the war.
Rommel, the celebrity super general, served in some ways as an excuse for the British forces. That why are we getting defeated? It's because we're fighting a Superman, not because our tactics are poor, our equipment's poor, our leadership hasn't quite got its act together.
On July 1st, Rommel resumed his offensive and continued attacking through to the end of the month. A staff officer, Friedrich von Mellenthin, wrote,
On paper, we seem to have won the Crusader battle, but the price paid was too heavy. The Panzergruppe had been worn down, and it soon became clear that only one course remained, a general retreat from Cyrenaica.
The theater of war grows large, with many players and perhaps many acts before the tragedy's finale.
On the 13th of August, General Bernard Montgomery assumed command of the 8th Army, an event which, according to Jock Watt, who was there, caused more of a stir in the newspapers than in the ranks of the army.
You couldn't care less who was in command. All you wanted to do was leave in Cairo. You lived from day to day. Who was in command of the generals and people? No idea.
On his first day in command, Montgomery confronted Brigadier Freddie de Guingand.
Well, Freddie, my lad, you chaps seem to have got things in a bit of a mess here.
He was a very distinct character. He didn't dress in regulation uniforms. He had a funny accent. He was the type of character that a lot of the troops took to heart almost as a mascot.
Montgomery withstood Churchill's impatience until he was satisfied that the odds were right. And then, on the night of the 23rd, 24th October, opened his offensive with a bombardment by 900 guns.
And of course there were star shells. It was like daylight. There were star shells flying. Oh, a lot of whistling going on, which is bullets going through the air. But you know, you just carry on with it. If you dropped to the ground every time you had a whistling sound, you'd never get up.
I was standing next to our platoon officer, and he says, Evie, we're going to win this war.
Private Percy Gratwick had worked around Western Australia as a gold prospector. His letters, addressed to a mate in Port Hedland, have been preserved.
Well, old bean, here I am at last. Very sorry I haven't written before, but you know this life. Similar to bush life regarding writing.
In the heat of battle, he earned the Victoria Cross. An eyewitness reported,
Suddenly, without warning, Percy took out a grenade, climbed to his feet and galloped forward, holding his rifle in his left hand. It was so crazy, and he was so quick, the Jerrys didn't even know what was happening.
Percy Gratwick was killed. A week earlier, he celebrated his 40th birthday. And that was the battle. Thousands of ordinary men fighting for their lives, hundreds or thousands of kilometers from their homes. On October 29th, Rommel wrote to his wife,
I haven't much hope left. It is obvious that from now on the British will destroy us bit by bit.
In terms of the mythology, the great Rommel myth, most of that, bizarrely enough, came from the British side of admiring somebody who beat them continually, particularly in the desert. But the view from the German side was that Rommel was a thoroughly overrated commander and leader, careless of his men's lives, very bad with logistics.
The breakthrough began in the middle of the night of the 1st of November. Success was consolidated the next day, when the 4th Indian and the 51st Highland were sent in against Kidney Hill. Their breakthrough opened the road for the 7th and 10th Armoured, which raced through into open country.
In a strategic sense, from Alamein onwards, the British Commonwealth American alliance is on the offensive.
Now, Rommel having been compelled to advance over 1,000 miles in the wrong direction, the smiles come from the man who made him do it, General Montgomery.
On the 3rd of November, Rommel received a message from Hitler.
In the situation in which you find yourself, there can be no other thought but to stand fast. As to your troops, you can show them no other road than to victory or death.
Here's one incident that could be multiplied 100 times. A German tank is knocked out, a survivor surrenders, and our boys carry straight through.
13 Corps overran the Italian formations facing it, and the entire Axis line was now falling back as Rommel began his withdrawal along the coast.
One morning we saw a lot of burning going on, and another recce troop was sent forward and came back the signal, oh, it's a general exodus. In other words, the Germans are pulling back.
The pursuit of the beaten enemy continued, and this time there was to be no escape.
By escaping, if only to be pursued all along the North African littoral, Rommel had avoided the total defeat for which Montgomery hoped. But by any assessment, he had suffered a decisive loss, and the Allies, for the first time in the war, could celebrate. This, according to Churchill, who ordered that church bells be rung, was not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. Montgomery's army was going west to link up with the Americans.
The ship I got aboard took the first American troops over to Casablanca in North Africa. We didn't know where we were going until 3 days after, out at sea. We were the first American forces going to oppose Hitler and to fight Rommel.
On the 8th of November, the torch landings took place.
As the first grey streaks of daylight spread across the North African sky, they were still going ashore. It is the most encouraging sign of the change of fortune that we have yet been privileged to see.
General Fredendall, a controversial commander who never visited the front, pulled his force back to the Kasserine Pass. Rommel assaulted the new position on the 19th, smashing into the Allied lines and compelling US troops to withdraw.
The tank in the background has stalled. Its crew is still using the machine gun.
A soldier admitted,
We just lost our heads.
the truth was, as RAF Corporal Peter Baxter wrote in his diary,
The Americans merely lack training in battle conditions, and maybe aren't too sure what they're supposed to be fighting the Germans for.
The American response was to make changes, including the immediate removal of Fredendall. Command of 2 Corps passed to Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Allied forces reoccupied the Kasserine Pass on February 25th. The entry of the USA and events in North Africa, and even more on the Eastern Front, were of great significance. The war had changed. As for events in Asia, that was simply a different war.
Conventionally, the army has tended to have more political power than the navy. They've had different strategies, and that is another sort of political schism, which is actually to bedevil the Japanese war effort right through until 1945.
The naval staff pressed for occupation of the southern part of New Guinea. The combined fleet staff, led by Admiral Yamamoto, argued for drawing the American Pacific Fleet into a full-scale engagement. Admiral Yamamoto's argument was strengthened by an action on April 18th that did little damage and took only 50 lives. On that day, 16 specially adapted B-52 bombers took off from the carrier Hornet on a bombing raid over Tokyo. The raid is in the history books in the name of its commander, the Doolittle Raid. The aircraft lacked the range to return to the carrier, so they flew on to land in China. In response, Japan's Chinese Expeditionary Army was ordered to knock out air bases in Chekiang and Kiangsi to prevent their future use by American aircraft. A force of some 140,000 men was mobilized. Between mid-May and the end of August, the Japanese suffered about 1,600 deaths. The Chinese lost about 40,000 dead. But soldiers were not the only victims.
Willingness to give a military essentially abusive free rein over a civilian population did not seem problematic, and it didn't seem that it would threaten Japan's reputation in a modern wartime environment.
A lady known only as Mrs. Chen gave evidence after the war.
A woman gave birth to a baby in the mountains, and, of course, a newborn cries very loudly. If the Japanese soldiers heard and went into the mountains, the young girls of the village would all be raped and murdered. It was really terrible. But we decided to kill the baby.
The factional clash that was dividing the High Command in Tokyo was resolved with a fatal face-saving compromise. Both strategies would be adopted. On May the 4th, the Battle of the Coral Sea was initiated when Yorktown launched airstrikes against an invasion fleet bound for Port Moresby, the key to New Guinea and the preferred naval staff strategy.
The Japanese had been victorious in every engagement up until that time. nothing had been able to stop them. They were, in effect, being treated as somewhat invincible by Allied troops who had developed the myth that the Japanese couldn't be stopped.
Around 8 in the morning of May 8th, the carrier forces located each other. For the first time, those serving aboard ships in a naval action never saw their opponents.
The thing to bear in mind about the Battle of the Coral Sea was that both admirals were faced with often the requirement to make a split-second decision about when to launch a carrier strike package, in which direction, and so on, really on the base of incomplete information.
The American carrier Lexington was hit and abandoned. The Japanese carrier Shokaku disabled and forced to retire. And the carrier Zuikaku, though undamaged, lost 40% of her air group. American carriers, too, sending their aircraft to the limit of their range, lost heavily. A final message from one American pilot.
Okay, so long, people. Remember, we got a 1,000-pound hit on the flat top.
The Coral Sea, it's said, is a tactical victory for the Japanese, and I think that that's probably accurate, and that they did sink the aircraft carrier Lexington at a time when there were not many aircraft carriers. But the campaign was turned back, so in that sense it was a strategic victory for the Allies.
Coral Sea compelled Japan to abandon plans for an invasion of New Guinea from the sea, and to attempt instead to take control by overland route. Now the moment for Yamamoto's strategy, destruction of the US Navy, had arrived. The action of the combined fleet was expected to neutralize American naval strength in the Pacific and deal with a small Hawaiian outlier that had provided cover for the carriers from which the Doolittle raiders flew, a place 3,100 kilometers from the nearest continent in any direction, Midway.
The Japanese objective at Midway was to destroy the US Navy. The plan was to entice the US Navy into a trap and destroy it.
Thanks to their codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Roquefort, the US Navy knew the Imperial Japanese Navy's plan. Admiral Nimitz would later toast Roquefort with the words,
"This officer deserves a major share of the credit for the victory at Midway."
Nimitz nominated Roquefort for the Distinguished Service Order, but internal jealousies conspired to deny him the award until 1985, almost 10 years after the cryptologist's death. Roquefort liked to say,
"We can accomplish anything, provided no one cares who gets the credit."
The Battle of Midway opened on June 4th, when aircraft from Admiral Nagumo's 1st Striking Force attacked aircraft and installations on Midway itself. When the aircraft returned to the carriers, the Admiral decided to re-equip them with bombs rather than torpedoes and launch a second attack on the island. The carriers were dispersed. Their fighter cover was operating at low altitude, and flight decks were crowded with rearming and refueling aircraft. At 10:20, Admiral Nagumo gave the order to launch when ready. Within 5 minutes, they would launch, and the Admiral would stand on the brink of a great victory. But they were, instead, 5 minutes that decisively changed the course of the battle and the war. In 5 minutes, Commander Wade McCluskey of the USS Enterprise's Bombing 6 Squadron led his 37 Dauntless dive bombers in from 14,500 feet in a 70-degree dive at 280 knots. The carrier Alongi was the first hit, then Kanga, last Sorgu, when Yorktown's dive bombers joined the assault.
The Japanese lost 4 of their first-line aircraft carriers, probably 4 of their 6 best, with all of their planes. And given the size of the Japanese economy, they were not able to replace those losses.
The heart of the Japanese naval strike force was sunk by 10 bombs. This was not, in terms of human life, a terrible battle. In terms of influence on history, it was the front rank.
What it did do was it shifted Allied thinking from defensive thinking to offensive thinking.
The news of Midway was passed to Prime Minister Tojo in typically obtuse language. General Moritake Tanabe told him,
"The Navy has made a great mistake."
Admiral Nobutake admitted,
Our forces suffered a reverse so decisive that details of it were kept a secret.
One Japanese naval captain, wounded in battle, said,
"I could not communicate with the world. All the wounded from Midway were treated like this. It was like being a prisoner of war among your own people."
In 1943 and 44, Japanese shipyards completed a total of 7 new carriers. American shipyards launched 90, and the 200 elite pilots Japan lost were irreplaceable. What mattered most about Midway was not that it was a victory, but that it was a battle with irreversible consequences.
And aircraft carriers with the ability to launch air power became the dominant force in naval warfare.
The empire that Japan had so rapidly expanded was vast. But it was mainly ocean, and after Midway, the Pacific would increasingly be an American sea. On land, Japanese control would be surrendered slowly and painfully and brutally. On February 1st, 1942, with fighting continuing in Singapore, the Philippines, the East Indies, 10 Australian prisoners of war who had surrendered to the Japanese were bayoneted to death on Ambona Island. Max Gilbert was amongst the Australians taken prisoner.
We were, to coin a phrase, lambs sent to the slaughter, because there were only about 1,100 of us, and there would have been only about that many Dutch-led Ambonese soldiers, so the action was very, very brief. And come the end of January, early February, the Dutch capitulated, and that's when I became a prisoner of war. Up till that time, I had not seen a Japanese soldier.
On February 4th, a further 30 Australian prisoners of war were bayoneted to death or decapitated. In charge of the killing, Lieutenant Nakagawa said,
"They were taken one by one to the spot where they were to die and made to kneel down with a bandage over their eye. Men stepped out of the ranks one by one as his turn came to behead a prisoner with a sword or stab him through the breast with a bayonet."
The next day, a further 30 Australian and Dutch prisoners of war were similarly killed. It went on and on. General Thomas Blamey, commanding Australian troops, was a World War I veteran. He said,
"Fighting Japs is not like fighting normal human beings. We are not dealing with humans as we know them."
Every history of the Second World War catalogues such cruelties. This was a war in which non-combatant deaths far outnumbered those who fought in uniform, victims of violence away from any battlefield. In Europe on February 4th, the day that Lieutenant Nakagawa supervised the murder of his prisoners, the 100 Jews of Rakov near Minsk were killed. The first transport, sent from Łódź to the extermination camp at Chełmno, contained Roma. It had departed on January 2nd. Abram Goldberg was an eyewitness.
They fenced off a square block where they put them. It was with extra barbed wire, with a ditch 2 meters deep, 2 meter wide, and those gypsies were the first to be deported to the death camp at Chełmno.
By January 9th, nearly 4,500 Roma had been gassed and buried in the surrounding forests. On the 16th, the first Jews were prodded into the gas vans.
So yes, there was knowledge, but this did not translate into action or a rejection of the regime because it simply was not important enough at that time.
On January 20th, experts met to formulate a plan for solving the problem of what the meeting calculated to be Europe's 11 million Jews. Held in the leafy Berlin suburb of Wannsee, just over half of those in attendance had doctorates. Adolf Eichmann, one of the main organizers of the mundane logistics of genocide, said,
"The talk was of killing, elimination, and annihilation."
In mid-March 1942, almost 3/4 of those who perished in the Holocaust were still alive. 11 months later, the same proportion were dead. Abraham Lewin wrote in his Warsaw Ghetto diary,
"The turmoil and terror is appalling. Mothers lose their children. A week-old woman is carried. The rabbi from 17 Zielna Street has been seized. Children walking in the street are seized."
The reasonable question that everybody can ask is, how is it possible that these people, Germans of moral character, could carry out hideous crimes without seeing? Can't you just see that they're people? Can't you see the tears in their eyes?
Moshe Fishman was amongst those manhandled onto wagons.
We had to line up in queues. I was pushed to one side. The sisters, maybe because they were holding on to dead. Who wouldn't?
When Abraham Lewin's wife was taken, he wrote,
"Eclipse of the sun, universal blackness. My Luba was taken away."
We can't even estimate closely to how many people actually survive in Poland. But what's very important to say is that those who survive with the hope of Poles.
On July 22nd, 1942, the gas chambers at Treblinka having been completed, deportations began from the Warsaw Ghetto.
They were shooting into the crowd, to hurry them out. Took them to the railway siding and they crammed them in the cattle trucks, 80 to 100 people, standing room only, no food, no water, no toilet, nothing. Where were they going? We didn't know. Where could they take the people? Where could they take children?
Using this rail network, which they ran with enormous efficiency, they transported Jews from every corner of Europe, and they ran those lines to the network of death camps that they operated.
The ghetto poet, Władysław Szlengel, wrote of the fake station at Treblinka.
There is no cashier, no baggage man. Not for $1 million will you get a return ticket. No one is waiting on the station. No one waves a handkerchief. Only a silence hangs.
I think there really is a lot of evidence, but someone who does not want to be convinced, you can't convince him. If he believes in alternate facts, then how to convince him?
Does war bring out the worst people or the worst in people? Young American Marines on Guadalcanal beheaded 3 Japanese prisoners of war and put their heads on poles. Their commander told them they were behaving like animals. And one of them answered,
"That's right, Colonel, we are animals. We live like animals. We eat and are treated like animals. What do you expect?"
An archipelago of almost 1,000 islands, the Solomon Islands is critically positioned off the eastern cape of Australia. The Japanese called the main island Guararukararu. The Americans called it Cactus. It was Guadalcanal.
Guadalcanal was the first true Japanese disaster of the war. If the Japanese had really been paying attention, if their commanders had really been thinking strategically, they would have garrisoned Guadalcanal effectively before the Americans got there.
Japanese troops landed in April 1942 as part of their sweep through the Western Pacific. On July 5th, intelligence was received that ensured Cactus a place in the story of the war, and particularly in the history of the US Marine Corps. The Japanese were observed to be building an air base.
And from that airfield, they based aircraft which could range over all of the Solomon Islands and further south, over the Coral Sea.
Don McFarlane, an Australian planter of coconuts and rubber on Guadalcanal, had escaped to the interior and become one of the coast watchers. Hidden in the jungle, he radioed on August 6, 1942.
Runway in position. Gravel and clay, not cement. Stop. Troops, half Labor Corps.
Admiral William Halsey of the U.S. Navy paid the highest praise to the Coast Watchers. He said that the Coast Watchers saved Guadalcanal, and Guadalcanal saved the South Pacific.
Through rough, almost uncharted waters, cruisers and destroyers of the Pacific Fleet blast the way for the invasion force of the United States Marines.
On August 7th, American forces landed on Guadalcanal. It was the first landing by American forces in the Pacific, and the first of a series of island names to be indelibly inscribed in American history. The landing met little opposition. The first American casualty was a Marine who cut his hand trying to slice open a coconut. The Japanese force established on Guadalcanal numbered 2,200, mainly construction workers. They were taken completely by surprise and withdrew to the mountains.
They named Henderson Airfield after a Marine pilot who'd been killed at the Battle of Midway. And they occupied that on the 8th.
Smoking shorelines testify to American success in chasing the Jap from a vital stepping stone to Australia.
The night after the initial landing, a Japanese naval task force of 7 cruisers and a destroyer caught an Allied force steaming through the 15-kilometer-wide channel between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, sinking the American and Australian cruisers with a loss of 1,270 Allied seamen and 34 Japanese dead. Following the Battle of Savo Island, the US Navy withdrew, leaving the Marines on Guadalcanal without support.
They shipped me off to Guadalcanal, 1942. Then they shipped me to another island, Rendova. We hit that island July the 2nd, and my captain says, we're gonna be in for a nice July 4th vacation. He set up 4 guns. And sure as shooting, the Japs try to take back the island.
And the Marines, after successful invasion, hold tight to their gains despite counterattacks by the Japs.
On August 18th, the Japanese landed reinforcements on Guadalcanal.
I recall reading one account where a Marine approaching the island is taken aback by the lushness of it and the Edenic qualities of what the island looked like from the sea. But then as he left, he only could describe it as a green hell.
A Japanese document declared,
"Success or failure in recapturing Guadalcanal is the fork in the road which leads to victory."
The first Japanese counterattack went in on August 21st. They attacked at night because they believed that Americans, being effeminate, would not like fighting at night. 1,000 attacked, and as often is the case in the heat of battle, the details of what followed are disputed, but not the outcome. American losses were small. Japanese losses were immense, and their commander, Colonel Ichiki, was either killed or killed himself. That the battle is an American victory is not disputed. Marine William Heggie wrote in his diary,
Radio reports claim that Friday's battle was history's greatest slaughter.
One of the songs sung by the Japanese army as it went to war had this verse.
Across the sea, corpses in the water. Across the mountain, corpses heaped upon the field. I shall die only for the emperor. I shall never look back.
On December 1st, 1942, General Hideki Tojo, recently appointed Japanese Prime Minister, declared,
"Our empire stands at the threshold of glory or oblivion."
The battle for Guadalcanal continued until the final Japanese evacuation at the beginning of February. By that time, 1,600 Americans had been killed, and as many as 32,000 Japanese lost to military action or disease.
75% of the Japanese losses were to non-battle casualties. The US 1st Marine Division had over 10,000 casualties. Of those, something like 1,500 were battle casualties. The rest were health-related.
No one could guess how long, how bitter and bloody was the road that yet lay before them. The road to Tokyo.
The Battle of the Coral Sea had frustrated Japanese plans to take Port Moresby in an amphibious landing.
Port Moresby is important because the Japanese want it so that they can cement their southern defensive arc and also use that position to then harass the northern Australian cities and try and sever the link between Australia and the US.
The alternative to an amphibious landing was to cross the Owen Stanley Range and fall on the New Guinea capital from the rear.
The terrain itself is key, and in many ways it's what defines the Fighting Kokoda, the formidable Owen Stanley Range.
The terrain was simply described by an Australian officer.
Ridge after ridge, Ridge after ridge, heartbreaking.
There was an airfield at Buna, and General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Western Pacific Theater, decided he would need it for future operations. In July, a small Australian force was sent from Moresby to trek overland to Buna, along a track that took its name from a small village around the halfway point, Kokoda.
This is not a great war of movement. It's not a war of mechanization. There's not big trucks and lorries going along the Kokoda Trail to resupply the soldiers. Things are carried up by men.
A Japanese force of 2,000 under Colonel Yosuke Yokoyama had landed at Gona on July 21st and was trekking towards the unsuspecting and heavily outnumbered Australians.
From Kokoda on the north, they planned to use exactly the same tactics as they did successfully in Malaya. The troops had bicycles and they would go along the track. The Japanese completely misread the terrain.
On July 23rd, first contact was made. An Australian unit diary reported,
Lieutenant Colonel Owen, after the destruction of all possible stores, material and buildings at Kokoda, withdrew with all troops.
It was the beginning of a fighting withdrawal down the track towards Moresby. Towards the end of September, coming under pressure from relatively fresh troops, the Japanese began their own fighting withdrawal.
The rain was coming down, and there was a long string of dog-tired men straining to get wounded men down.
The Japanese could not expect relief. An attempted landing at Milne Bay had been repulsed. The first time an attempted Japanese amphibious landing had been turned back.
They would come and set up a machine gun alongside of a tree. As fast as one would get killed there, another would take his place. They would do that for a number of hours. You had to think of somebody's son, somebody's father, or somebody's husband.
On January 2nd, 1943, Buna fell to the Allies.
There are tired men here in these heroes of Buna. They've seen death, yet still smile. But they know against the Jap, we have not yet begun.
As the Asia-Pacific War was being fought on sea and across some of the most difficult and hostile land, Hitler's summer offensive for 1942, Case Blue, his army swollen by more than 40 new divisions, had driven deep into Russian territory.
In 1942, as the weather improves, as the roads dry out, as the steppe is firm, the Germans embark on a massive offensive.
The story of Eastern Europe during the months of Midway, of Guadalcanal and Kokoda, is the story of a smashing German offensive that comes unstuck and finally turns the tide of the war.